Okay, I'm going to try this again. This was the qtronman. My first point was just that we don't want to fall into the same circular paths of argumentation. We have these arguments. It gets very frustrating on one level because they repeat themselves over and over ad nauseum. On the other hand, what's really going on is that we're understanding something about the patterns, and we should just see that there's these patterns. And to the degree that we want to break them so we can make progress, then we should just break them. We should find where the patterns repeat. One way of doing this is to try to find some new concepts to use as a common ground. Okay, now to do this there is some, just collaboration, but there's also argumentation where, I might try to use your own philosophy to argue that you should accept something from that I also adopt in my philosophy that I argue from, and that you should be able to accept that. So for example, this idea of public versus private, I don't really think that there's a way for an objectivist, or for that matter, though they're different philosophies, market anarchists and libertarians, to really say there is such a thing as a public organization. All organizations, including ones that end up claiming to be public, start out as private organizations, groups of men, or maybe women, getting together, pooling their joint property, like their guns, and fighting off some army that makes a claim as to public representation. And then they make that claim, but it's never actually true. There's nothing that they can do to turn their private organization into a public one. They merely claim that because of all the philosophy that then legitimizes things that, if they were to do them as a private organization, would be considered immoral. And I think that as an objectivist, or any of these other kinds of philosophies, you have to admit that if a government does something immoral, it's just as immoral as if a private organization does it. And vice versa, though, as well. If something is immoral, it can't be immoral just because it's done in the name of a public institution. It must be that it's actually immoral in some other sense. Okay, another issue just specifically with objectivism that I'd like to bring up, that's a challenge that I think this is a stopping point where maybe there's a way to change this interaction. But there's a communication problem involved with this, which is that subjectivity is about the self. The self is the subject. Subjectivity means coming through the reference frame of the self. And a self-interested philosophy, can be self-interested for various reasons. Now, mine starts with the self, because how else are you going to start? We are ourselves. That is what we start with. Therefore, I'm going to start with that in my philosophy, because it's just more accurate to the situation that we're in. So objectivity, though, is the opposite of that. Now, objectivists love objectivity and like to say that only things that are objectively true are true. So the subjective truths either have an objective basis or are just illusions and intangible, and in a way don't matter, and they're insignificant or distractions even. So in other words, if something is beautiful or not, that will only be true if there's an objective definition of beauty. If it's just a subjective definition of beauty, then it wouldn't be real. And yet you have a self-interested philosophy. Why do you go to the selves to find out what is right and wrong and all of this, to let people decide for themselves, if you can figure out an objective way to decide what is right and wrong for them without reference to the self? If everything can be that's real and true can be figured out objectively, why do you go to the self to figure it out? So I think there's a contradiction there, because basically if you have a self-interested philosophy, it makes sense for you to trace everything back to the self, including so-called objective truths.